Hello, I'm Paula Bolton, co-founder of Lesbian Labour. Welcome to our Proud Lesbian series. During Pride Month, I'll be interviewing a wide range of lesbians to gather lesbian perspectives and to hear about lesbian lives in 2022. And my eighth interviewee is a lesbian you might well have heard of, and that's Bev Jackson, who pops up all over the place at the moment talking about LGB Alliance. But we are going to talk to Bev about herself. So what's behind the Bev Jackson? Right, Bev, maybe you could start us off. Could you tell us just something about your life as a lesbian?
Well, thanks for having me on, Paula. Happy to do this. I remember a little girl I was very keen on when I was 5, and this was Wendy. I always wanted to save Wendy, and Wendy didn't want to be saved. And this has been a bit of a thread that's gone through my life. But I suppose, although it's not got to do directly with lesbianism, I became me at the age of 11. This is the most important thing that happened in my childhood, because I grew up in a Jewish. I come from a Jewish background, but you know, it was not Orthodox or anything. We didn't go to synagogue, but I knew that we were Jewish, and I grew up in Four Oaks, Sutton Coldfield, which was quite an anti-Semitic neighbourhood. And when my mother went to introduce herself to the neighbour, she said, "Well, what's the neighbourhood like?" And the neighbour said, "Well, no, it's quite nice. There's no Jews or anything." So that was the kind of atmosphere. And so when I went from primary school to secondary school, I was very conscious of the fact that I was different, and I had never told anybody, and I had this desperate urge. I really needed to tell people, but I didn't have any friends at primary school because I think I was a very nerdy, peculiar child, and my mother was a nutcase, to be quite honest. Anyway, so I thought, I've got to tell people. And we had this horrible teacher who taught English and history and religious knowledge, and she kept making anti-Semitic jokes. And this was in 1962, so not that long really after the war. And I was getting more and more upset and thinking, I haven't told them. And at some point, after saying something about all Jews are wealthy and have big noses, she looked around the class and she said, "I suppose nobody here is Jewish." And the whole class roared with laughter at the absurd idea that anybody could be Jewish. And I put my hand up and said, "Please, miss, I have some Jewish relations," which was a complete understatement because I'm, 100% Jewish. And then a couple of minutes later, I had to go to the toilet and throw up because I was so nervous. And I thought, now I'm never going to have any friends. Now, I mean, that woman was not representative of the school, because my class teacher called me to her afterwards and said, "I heard that something happened. And if anybody else ever says anything anti-Semitic to you, you tell me and I'll kick them down the stairs." So there were good people there. But that experience was so formative, being, the idea that I was different from everybody else and that I dared to say so. And that's really been the defining feature of my life, of not really wanting to, but needing to say the truth. Yeah. If the truth has to be said, I will say it. And so I also came out then as lesbian quite early on, at 15, and had the same sort of, this was in Hove. We had moved to Hove by then. And there's also quite a homophobic environment, and but it gave me the strength to stand up against the crowd, and that has really informed my whole life.
It's a really strong place to start, really, because that sense of being different, whatever the difference is, runs right the way through much of the homophobia, the lesbophobia, what have you, anti-Semitism. It's that knowledge that you, for whatever reason, are different, and othering from the other side, the othering that is going on, whatever the reason. So yeah, I can see that has stood you in good stead as well, Bev, because once you've done it, do you still get sick? Do you still want to throw up when you speak out?
No, actually, I've gradually, I mean, over the last 3 years, I've discovered that because we've been called so many completely insane names, that it doesn't hurt me anymore. I just think, well, they just don't know. They think most of them probably just think it's true, and it's unfortunate. This is how indoctrination, this is how propaganda work.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Putin has managed to convince, I think, something like 70% of Russians that he's pursuing some valiant action in Ukraine. I mean, this is how indoctrination and propaganda works. So I don't feel as upset as I used to.
Yes.
I mean, sometimes it's upsetting, especially when people whose opinion you thought you valued turn against you. I've lost a couple of friends, and that's painful.
Yeah. So once you were out and you were in lesbian relationships, did you encounter much objection from within your family?
Wait a minute, I didn't have any lesbian relationships. I just knew that I was. In fact, my mother told me I was a lesbian. You're a lesbian, aren't you? And she described in graphic detail all the things she imagined. I mean, I told her she was a complete nutcase. All the things she imagined I would presumably want to do. Anyway, so
she was telling you rather than you telling her and her rejecting you for it.
Yes. I mean, at some point, first of all, she sent me off to a psychiatrist because she thought that probably I needed some therapy. And I described the home situation to the psychiatrist, and he just said, well, if anybody's mad, it must be your mother. I don't think there's anything wrong with you. And he sent me away again. So, and then later she decided that having a daughter who was a lesbian was actually quite a badge of honor. And so she would boast about it, because she's got this lesbian daughter that made her feel more interesting. And she only always wanted to be interesting. Well,
there you go. She's given us a very interesting daughter. So thank you to your mother in absentia there.
I do thank her every Christmas dinner. I say, and thank you to my mother, without whom most of us would not be here,
etc. So was there any objection within your family or your siblings, perhaps, or
not well. I mean, I only really had contact because my mother never met anybody. So I never met anybody, only very briefly, from my father's side of the family. But they were a bit homophobic, and so I lost contact with them quite soon. So I was always associated more with my mother's side of the family, and I would say there was not really much homophobia there. No.
Okay, so the era then that you came out in, when you went off to study, what was it like there in terms of the scene as such? Was there any evidence of lesbian organizing, or what was going on?
Well, when I was 17, and for the first time I spent a night away from home because I was going to Nottingham to have an interview at the university. I stayed a night in London, and I thought there must be a lesbian club. There must be. So I was going to phone up the Citizens Advice Bureau to find out where there was a lesbian club. But then I suddenly realized I didn't have any pajamas. So I went off to Marks and Spencer's and buy some pajamas. And by the time I bought my pajamas, the Citizens Advice Bureau was shut. I thought, oh, damn. So instead of the Citizens Advice Bureau, I phoned up the Samaritans, and I said, excuse me, terribly sorry to bother you, don't want to commit suicide or anything, but I was wondering if you could tell me about where I could find a lesbian club. And they gave me the number of Cynthia and Julie, who at that moment were running Kenrick. Now, Kenrick, the name of which is formed from Kensington and Richmond, was at that time a funny little place that lesbians went to have tea and biscuits in Cynthia and Julia's home. And it's mutated out of all recognition, I think, today. But anyway, that's what it was. And so I went there several times, and they took me to the gateways. And that was amazing, because I remember going there, and I remember this scene of this woman outside saying to somebody, I'm a bigger lesbian than you are any day. And I've always wondered what she meant by that, and she never, anyway. And so the first thing I said to Cynthia and Julia when we got in there was, why are there so many men here? And they laughed and laughed, because there weren't any men. But it was very much a butch and femme scene. So all the butches were dressed in suits and, very, very masculine looking attire. And so it looked almost like a heterosexual club. and I was amazed. I thought, this is wonderful. I want to be one of these butches. So I after that, I adopted quite a butch style, and it was great fun. But I wasn't really part of a lesbian scene. And actually, one of the reasons, I mean, of course, after that, I noticed that somebody put up a poster. I was at LSE. I didn't go to Nottingham or Durham. I went to LSE, and there was a poster on the wall saying, first meeting of the Gay Liberation Front. I thought, gay? That's homosexual liberation, freedom front. But I didn't know what it was, but I thought, I want to be there. And so most lesbians at that time in 1970 were drawn more to women's liberation and to women's groups and to separatist lesbian groups. But I didn't feel much affinity. I felt more, I thought my being a lesbian was more important to me than being a woman at that time. So gay liberation sounded like the place for me. So I went to this first meeting, and I was the only woman there. There was 19 men and me. And so since they wanted a woman in the steering committee, they immediately chose me to be in the steering committee, which was really rather silly because most of them had really quite good political backgrounds. They were Marxists, most of them, and this was a liberation struggle, and I was a bit out of my depth politically speaking, very much so. But they wanted me in the steering committee so they could have a woman. And then the second meeting, there were 100 people there. And there was a few other women, and I think Mary McIntosh was one of the people who came to that second meeting, and maybe Elizabeth Wilson, but I'm not absolutely sure. And I remember at one point a man saying, it was clear in our initial manifesto that we felt it was really important for the gay liberation struggle to be parallel with women's liberation. That you have to, if you beat sexism in society and beat the patriarchy, that this is something that has to go in tandem. And that was very important at the beginning of Gay Lib. And but there was also some misogyny. And one man said, yeah, we should invite women's liberation to come to one of our meetings. And then another man said, yes, they can bring sandwiches and coffee. And that has stuck in my mind also forever. You know, there are some things that you just never forget. And that warned me. I thought, okay, this is not going to be easy. But gay men and lesbians to work together is not going to be easy. And it's absolutely not the case that this misogyny was endemic. I mean, but some of the men were definitely not very friendly towards women, let's say. Whereas
it's interesting that I have found from, well, my own experience, but also talking to others, that trying to understand where that comes from, in the same way that if you're living a lesbian-centered life and you have very little to do with men, I think that gay men that live within a gay male community have very little to do with women. And although it is as bad in a way as heterosexual men and their misogyny, I think it comes from a different place, because sometimes it's kind of, well, I don't know, what do women do? You know, they're more prone to accept the total stereotypes of what women do in an unchallenged way.
I think that that heterosexual misogyny is quite confused because heterosexual men both need women and in some cases have negative feelings about them. So it's a mixed kind of feeling.
Yes, it is a different beast.
Whereas among some gay men, there can be undiluted distaste for women, because there's no need for them and they just are not part of their lives at all. And
that's the thing. That's what I'm on about. And it feels different as well. It feels like quite difficult to challenge. Anyway, so can you wind us forward? So there you are, you're at Gay Liberation Front at college. What happens next?
So well, I was quite a disturbed teenager and I had a difficult time of it, and I realized in a sense that I'd spent the first 18 years of my life in a matchbox and hadn't experienced anything. And I sort of really wanted to start life again. Also, there were a couple of things about living in London or living in the UK which didn't feel like, I didn't really feel I belonged there. One thing was the emphasis on class distinctions, which I really didn't like. I found it oppressive. And I didn't like the kind of tendency that was there in my time, which was for people to form little circles of like-minded people. So lesbians to cluster together, and people of similar income to cluster together, and people of similar politics to govern. And I just didn't like those things. I had always wanted to be friends with a wider range of people and not to have these barriers. It was important to me. And I just wanted, also because I'd had a troubled upbringing and a really bad relationship with my mother. My father died when I was 15. And I just wanted to go away as far as possible. And I said to my tutor at the time, John Bell, very nice man, taught philosophy. I said, I think I'm going to go to Australia, because that was the furthest way, and he said, well, look, if you have to go somewhere, why don't you choose somewhere more, progressive, more sensible? Why don't you go to Amsterdam? And he determined my life, because I did then go to Amsterdam, and I've been here ever since. And what I really loved about Amsterdam was the fact that it's a far less class-based system. People of different classes and different incomes associate with each other without any problem. Gay and straight people also mix with each other without any problem. And people are far more open. That was something that I really found difficult in the UK, that people are not, I experienced, as open as I like to be about all sorts of things. I mean, whether it's religion or politics or sex or just personal matters, I'm the sort of person who discusses everything with everyone.
Yeah.
And therefore, I found it a breath of fresh air to be in Amsterdam, where these things are more possible, and where even difficult things like euthanasia, abortion, drugs, it's all discussed on a pragmatic level in order to achieve the best harmony possible in society. Now, that's a bit idealistic, our society's broken down a bit. I think all societies have broken down a bit in the last 10 years. But some of those values, I think, have remained intact in Holland, I hope, to this day.
Well, I mean, we both know I also lived in Holland for a while. And I would agree with that. I really felt like I'd moved 25 years into the future when I arrived, and the breadth of thinking, the openness, I thought was wonderful, and this ability to achieve consensus, which I think I've never seen it rivaled anywhere else.
Yeah.
That, each nation has a different way of doing things, but even the round table government, to have to find a way that all those smaller parties can all work together, you just have to keep going at it.
Well, it starts at kindergarten, because the very first thing that children do when they're 3 or 4 years old is they sit in a circle and they have to listen to each other. And if it's someone's birthday, then they celebrate it. And if it is, and if somebody's grandmother's died, or somebody's dog is, I mean, everybody, you have to listen to each other, and you have to work as a class. And there is far less, I won't, as I say, I don't want to paint a too idealistic picture, because I think there's quite a lot of racism in Dutch society, much more than people realize. And that is a problem. I mean, you've seen that with Black Pete, that the Dutch really have tremendous trouble understanding that Black Pete is a racist caricature. But in general, in most ways, it is a tolerant society in which people are willing to compromise and listen to each other and make a harmonious society together.
Yeah. So in terms of the scene as such, did it feel very different for you when you moved to Amsterdam?
Well, I went. Did
you find your way into the gay scene there? Yeah,
I mean, I went to the COC, which, as far as I remember, the COC used to shut at 12, and then we went on to the DOK, which didn't shut until 2. But and then we had there was a lesbian only night which was only once a month, I think, which I used to go to for a while. But it was uncontroversial. I mean, none of this was at all controversial. And when I started my first long-term relationship, which I formed with Pat when I was 22, Pat came from America, we decided we wanted lots of children, but we didn't actually get around to doing much about it until our relationship was almost on the rocks. And I got pregnant when I was 30, and we had our first child, and then we split up. But we became co-parents and shared parenting responsibilities. And then I had another child 10 years later, and I again shared the parenting responsibilities with Pat, and we lived quite close together. And so half of the week, well, a bit more than half the week with me, and a bit less with her, and that's how I brought up my children. And I've got grandchildren now, because my elder daughter has got two daughters, so two daughters and two granddaughters. I feel very blessed.
Well, that's wonderful. Doubling each time. And again, that's something I did notice in Holland, was the alternative parenting arrangements, which were quite common. Yeah. And accepted. You know, people do it differently, and they will work out what works for them, and that it's nothing to do with the state or anybody else. It's just the diversity of relationships, regardless who they're between. So my elder daughter, for instance, who started school in 1986. I remember at some point at secondary school said, "Did anybody have you ever experienced any homophobia because you were brought up by lesbians? Has anybody ever asked you funny questions about it?" And she said, "Well, no, only you, actually." So there was no homophobia even then. And as far as my younger daughter was concerned, who grew up in the 1990s, there were other lesbian parents in the group, so it wasn't even at all remarkable. And my next door neighbors are also lesbians. I mean, it's just not particularly, it's not a thing. Mm. There's no need for, well, I say there's no need for, perhaps you think that it's unfortunate, but we just don't feel particularly the need for a special culture. I associate it more with the parents of other children at the same age as my daughters. Yeah. So were you aware at all, because of your obviously being from England, did you know what was going on back in the UK? Very little, to be quite honest. I mean, the whole time when I was bringing up my children was quite stressful, because I was bringing up two children. For a lot of that time, I had a job at the ministry in The Hague, at the foreign ministry, so I had to commute back and forth. So bringing up two children, and at the same time, I ran my own translation business. So I had virtually no life other than those things: bringing up my children, going back and forth to The Hague, and doing my translation business. And so for years and years, I was not conscious really of anything going on. Mm. And then it really wasn't until 2016 that I started noticing that something funny was happening. So a very, very long period in which I just assumed everything was better. You know, there was equal marriage, of course, in Holland, I think the first in the world, and followed much later by the UK. And I did get married when I met my wife much later in 2009, and we got married. So and is it a state-sanctioned civil partnership with bells on, or is it exactly the same as? It's just exactly a marriage. It's just it's an actual marriage. I always think it's very funny when people say what does the LGB Alliance think about marriage? And I always think, well, my wife and I are quite in favour, to be quite honest. Yeah. Is there any issue there? I mean, obviously the Church of England don't sanction it. I mean, it's different. We don't have an established church in Holland, and that's a big thing. It's a big difference between the UK and Holland. We do not have an established church. In fact, our freedom of education in Holland, which means freedom of any group to form their own schools,
is a very, very important part of Dutch society.
Mm.
And I was a teacher in the 1970s and a university teacher in the 1980s. And while I was a teacher at secondary school, I taught at two Catholic schools. And I was always out. I never ever hid the fact that I was a lesbian.
Mm.
In fact, one was a little Catholic school outside in a village. Now, there was a little bit of homophobia there, and I did leave because I thought, I think these people are a little bit narrow-minded, but it was never really threatening.
Mm. Yeah. Okay. So your working life, you just mentioned as you were going through there, school teacher, university lecturer, at the ministry, and your own translation business. So you've done a variety of jobs, haven't you, by the sound of it?
Yeah, yes.
And
yeah,
apart from that little bit of homophobia there, has your sexuality ever been an issue in any of those?
Well, no, I would say not. I mean, the Dutch children are very, very rude and don't have any respect for authority. So I remember at one point I was pregnant, and one little smart-ass 12-year-old said, "Who got you pregnant, miss?" Because they knew I was a lesbian,
Say it like it is, yeah.
And I just said, "Well, none of your business," and so on.
Yeah.
But they're just very upfront about things. So there's no sort of nastiness. I mean, it was quite funny.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting because obviously you almost landed in this world where what I call the assimilated culture that we had very briefly here. So you've been living a normal life, but as a lesbian in another country. So did you have any sense at all about, lesbian only spaces and where others might be able to gather and enjoy themselves? Was there much evidence of that, or was the lesbian world fused with the gay men's world in Holland?
Well, it certainly was when I arrived in the 1970s. We did have a lesbian-only cafe. There were two, actually. One that was really very serious. Three. Yeah, there was the Women's House.
At Flower House.
The Flower House was quite serious about women only.
Yeah.
And there was Sarijn, which was fairly serious about only having women, and then later relaxed quite a lot. And then there was a little cafe around the corner from me, which was supposedly, it was run by lesbians, but it was just much more mixed. And those were the three. And I did gravitate towards them. I, definitely went to the Flower House and felt at home there, and felt at home at Sarijn. And those things have gradually become watered down over the years. And I think that what is sad is that you couldn't run a lesbian-only space now. And that's not because lesbians are now, lesbians are always going to be economically lower, lower in income than gay men, not just because some of them, about a third maybe, will have children, but also because of the inequality of wages between men and women. So they tend to be poorer. But of course, lesbians are not poorer, relatively speaking, now than they were in the 1970s. Yeah. But I think that what's happened is that you wouldn't be able to run a lesbian-only space because so many lesbians now don't want to think of themselves like that. They don't want to go to a space which has been branded by the LGBTQ monolith as exclusionary. They feel uncomfortable, and I think that's terrible. That really, really upsets me. That instead of it just being a nice place to go, where where you meet other lesbians, it's become a kind of statement of no, where we're going. It's a political statement instead of just being a nice place to meet other women.
Were you aware of what was happening in the women's movement as opposed to the lesbian and gay liberation type movement?
Well, we had a fantastic women's movement in Holland in the 1970s, especially, fighting for abortion rights and a good lesbian or a good women's paper. And as happened, I think, in the UK, these things just gradually fizzled out. But the the women's movement kept going in the UK, and it didn't keep going in Holland. Now, quite why that is, I think a lot of it has to do with the union movement. I mean, women have always been very strong in the union movement in the UK, and I don't think we have that same consciousness, political consciousness, union consciousness in Holland. In fact, Dutch culture is quite regressive in some ways, because for years and years, for instance, children came home, primary school children came home for lunch. Well, if they're going to come home for lunch, there has to be a woman there to give them their lunch. And if you didn't want to do that, you had to pay extra to support the people who came and took care of the children in lunch hour, the ones that were not allowed to go home. Or you had to be one of the parents who actually took part in this rota of taking care of you. And so, and also, I mean, the birthday culture in Holland is completely mad.
Yes.
I mean, children have 4 separate birthdays. You have a birthday party for your friends, you know, which is a huge organization. And then you have a birthday party with your family and other adults. And then you have a birthday party at school, in which if you've got 30 children in your class, you had to bring 30 plus 10 for the teachers items to hand out. I mean, and who is going to make all this stuff? The mother has to do all this stuff. And it's just a huge, I said there were 4, and I've forgotten what the 4th is, but anyway, it's just the birthday culture places a huge burden on mothers who have children and who don't want their children to be thought of in any worse way, because they haven't been handing out nice snacks on their birthday.
So what's just in comparison, again, it's interesting because you'll have been seeing what's going on here through a filter, I suppose, but in terms of representation and lesbian culture, so films, books, music, TV, is that different? Has it been a normal part of TV, for instance, in Holland for years, whereas it hasn't been here?
You know, I find that really difficult to answer, because I basically, and this is quite shocking, this is a shocking admission, but I hardly ever watch Dutch TV. I mean, I because I'm a translator and I live in Holland, it's very important for me to keep in touch with British culture and language. And therefore, I just routinely only watch British programs. I mean, I do turn on the Dutch news from time to time, but I'm far more familiar with what's going on in the UK than I am with what's going on around me, which is, my family get quite cross about it, I have to tell you.
Okay. I suppose there's like cultural references that go over your head. I mean, they go over mine because I don't watch telly full stop, so I'm not the right person here either. But I have it on fairly good authority that there has been an uplift or an increase in lesbian representation in popular culture over the last 20 years. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but what kind of, you mean in Holland?
Well, I mean, you know, you can speak from your own personal experience, which, I
mean, of course, we've had, because you've got people like Ellen DeGeneres and you've got Martina Navratilova and these very, very high profile lesbians and Megan Rapinoe, that you see, they have created an environment in which there is now, and also Rachel Maddow, these are very, very high profile lesbians who've created a world in which it is no longer at all odd to be lesbian, and that is in itself a good thing. It's just unfortunate that none of them are willing, except for Martina, to stand up for lesbians in the way that you and I would understand what it means. And especially, I mean, what Megan Rapinoe said the other day was really quite shocking, I thought. So
let's say what she said then. Tell us about that.
Well, Megan Rapinoe thinks that it's horrible to not accept trans women in women's sport, and that it really shouldn't matter. And high school soccer was not so important. She said. Now this is, I mean, looking back at her own career, I think she wouldn't have said that while she was at high school herself. She presumably thought it was quite important while she was at high school And I think the number of people who are willing to, who want to seem progressive and kind, and are therefore just willing to completely ignore the rights of not just lesbians, but women in general, I find extraordinarily depressing.
So
and so it's just wonderful that Martina does
speak out,
does stand out in that respect.
So you noticed things beginning to shift about 2016, you said. So,
in 2016, I became quite shocked, because I said in a group of family and friends, and this was because I had seen a documentary that lodged in my mind and lodges in everybody's mind who's ever seen it. And that was a science documentary that my colleague Malcolm Clark was involved in, actually, in 2000, about people who have severe body dysmorphia, so severe that they believe that they should only have one limb or no limbs, or that they want to get rid of one of their limbs. And I said to somebody, I said in this group that wanting to get rid of your genitalia or your breasts was rather similar. And I got shouted at as if I'd said the most terrible thing. And I was really quite shocked, because it struck me that it was quite obvious that it was similar. If you want to get rid of a healthy part of your body, why was it not a similar thing? And I was accused of being like a racist, or it was really quite a shocking moment. That was a really shocking moment for me. And I thought, well, God, maybe they're right, and I better go and do some research. And then the more research I did, the more convinced I was that something bad was happening, especially to young LGB people. And it was just shocking to me that, I remember, in the 1970s, a boy would hear, oh, you're girlish, you're just like a girl, and that was an insult. And now people were saying that a girlish boy was a girl. And then I thought, God, it's not happening the other way around as well, is it? And I started investigating in 2017, I think, and discovering that actually there was a huge rise, an absolutely astronomical rise, in teenage girls wanting to be boys or thinking that they were boys. And then it really, really struck home to me, and I became emotionally quite, I suppose that's when I shifted to become really invested in this subject, because I knew that, I had called myself by boys' names. In fact, when I arrived in Amsterdam, I called myself Paul, P-O-U-L, after Paul Anderson, who was my favorite science fiction writer. And there was a woman who still called me Paul every time she met me for the next 10 years. But, and I just thought, oh God, if I had been growing up now, I would have been one of those. I would have been one of those girls who wanted to be boys, or thought they were boys, because I did think so. I didn't feel that I fitted in with girls at all. I would have been one of those, and I would have gone through that treatment. I would have got rid of my breasts. I would have had testosterone, and I would never have had my children and my grandchildren. And I was just so shocked that was happening to girls who were like me, and that the whole the notion of being a tomboy had disappeared. And actually, it's quite interesting, because I brought up my two children, one in the 1980s and one in the 1990s. The one I brought up in the 1980s, it was still possible to dress her in just ordinary clothes, unisex. Even bought some KLM overalls for her and sent her off to school in those. And I wouldn't allow her to play with Barbie dolls, because I thought they were a load of rubbish. And that was all possible. She rebelled against all that later, of course, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. But in the 1990s, that was impossible. Everything was suddenly, the boys were all Superman, the girls were all princesses, everything was blue here, pink there, and it was so obviously a commercially driven separation of the sexes. And it became extremely obvious to me that because it was no longer to be possible to be unisex, you had to fall into one of these two molds, that every child that didn't fall into one of these molds was made to feel uncomfortable. And then you come with this panacea Here we will explain why you feel uncomfortable. Well, you're really a boy, you're really a girl. And that is, I believe, where a lot of it comes from. So, I mean, I think it's important to understand the supply side, which is a lot of people are making money out of
Yes.
Persuading LGBT people that they're at the opposite sex. There's a, whereas you once had only one youth clinic a gender clinic in the United States, now you've got something like 60. So there's surgeons, there's clinics, administrative staff, endocrinologists. And I mean, when you see some of these doctors, the doctor in particular that advertises what she calls Titus deletus, I mean, this is outrageous. It is utterly, utterly disgusting. And these are young lesbians who are being persuaded that they can escape from womanhood. And most teenage girls can't go through a period of wanting to escape from womanhood, and that they can become men. And it's I just want to say a little bit, if I could, about conversion therapy, because it was very clear from a recent poll that the public does not understand about conversion therapy.
I'd agree.
So when the public hears about conversion therapy, I think most people think back to the horrors that there were with aversion therapy, with electrical devices and disgusting, cruel practices, which were imposed in an attempt to turn gay men or lesbians straight. Those practices have not existed in the UK for decades, and they were rightly outlawed, and that's disgusting. There are some pockets of attempts by, I think, religious fanatics to try and turn gay people straight. And if the government wanted to close those loopholes, I can understand why the UK government has decided to do that. And it's slightly odd that it's coming up now, when in fact there's not been a vast increase in that, as far as I'm concerned, and LGBTQ groups were not talking about it 5 years ago. But anyway, why am I opposed to including trans children in the ban on conversion therapy? To start with, what is a trans child? I think those labels are very, very unhelpful. There are children who are distressed about their sexed bodies. And that there may be all sorts of reasons for that. There are many, many reasons, as we've heard in the interim report from the CAS review. There may have been abuse. There is, in many, many cases, there is autism spectrum disorder. There may be loss of some kind, and in many, many, many cases, there is discomfort with sexual orientation. The vast majority of the kids, the teenagers who turn up at gender clinics, are, when they're asked about their sexual orientation, and they're not even asked always, which is extraordinary, but they do, when they're asked, say they're only attracted to people of the same sex. So these kids deserve better. They deserve better. They do not deserve to be channeled into drugs and surgery. They deserve for the reasons for why they feel so unhappy in their sexed bodies to be thoroughly explored. And I don't feel anybody under the age of 18 should be allowed to take drugs or go through surgery. In the UK, of course, you can't go through surgery before the age of 18, but some want to make it earlier. And in the United States, you do see teenage girls of 14 and even younger having their breasts removed. The reason that the conversion therapy debate has become so clouded is that it's been redefined. What the people who want a ban on conversion therapy to include trans children, they want, if a girl comes in and says, I'm a boy, I'm not questioning it. I'm not at all questioning it. I'm a boy. I know that. They know who they are. She knows she's a boy. Therefore, you must respect that. You mustn't try and talk her out of it. Now, I don't think you should try and talk anybody out of anything. Of course not. That's not what therapy is. Therapy should be neutral. It shouldn't affirm, it shouldn't deny. But we've seen when legislation to ban conversion therapy has been introduced in other countries, especially if you look in Victoria, which has been held up as a shining example, the kind of legislation we need in the UK, that when you ban conversion therapy of trans children, what it means is the therapists are not allowed to challenge or question a child's belief that she is the opposite sex. Now, this is terrible because there's been huge criminal penalties applied to this. Therapists who do challenge or question it are liable to years in prison. So what's the result? The result is either they don't challenge or question, which means that more children will be getting puberty blockers, which lead in almost all cases to cross-sex hormones and often to surgery and infertility. Or they just won't take those cases at all because they'll be afraid of being of doing something criminal. So these children who desperately need help will not get the help they need. Now, I believe that what's happening now, which is gay children ending up, if they believe they're the other sex and that isn't challenged enough, that they're taking hormone, that is a kind of conversion therapy. So this subject has been turned on its head. And no wonder that the public is confused about it. And what's so, I think, really quite wicked is to pretend that we don't want to protect, that people who are opposed to this, to including trans children or children with gender dysphoria in this ban, that we don't want to protect them. We do want to protect them. We want to protect them from making decisions they will regret. But why will they regret it? Because we know more and more women are coming forward when they're, but much later. Sometimes it takes them 8 or 10 years before they really realize. They're 25, 26, 27 years old and they think, my God, what have I done? I've got, I've got a deep voice, I've got beard growth, and I've got the atrophy of the vagina, and sometimes incontinence, and all sorts of really quite unpleasant physical things which people hardly ever mention. And I was just a lesbian, and why didn't I get the help I deserved? So this is a really important issue, and this is why we must wait for the recommendations of the CAS report before making any decisions on the best way to help children who are unhappy with their sexed bodies, and not to label them. I'm accused of saying trans children don't exist. That's ridiculous. Everybody exists, but labeling them when you're not quite sure what's going on is not helpful at all. Sorry, that's rather a long I hope.
Well, no, but it's important. There is a clear explanation of it, Bev, because this is a rare space where you can say it from start to finish without being interrupted.
But was it clear enough? Do you think it comes
across? No, I think that's a very clear explanation indeed. And where I'd like to take you from there actually is whilst we're talking about the way things have changed, because obviously that's probably the most important issue at the moment, because we're talking about saving future generations. But what are we saving them from? This idea of what a lesbian is or what a gay man is, clearly in legislation is based on same sex. So what has happened there? Why is that an issue nowadays? Why is there any contention?
Well, I suppose I think money is quite often an explanation of why things change. And as I said the other day, when same-sex marriage had been achieved in the UK, you had a very large organization that had perhaps too little to do. And there's a great push from America to include the other letters that have been included in the United States for much longer, and not to have LGB, but to be more inclusive. And at the time, those who were running Stonewall were unwilling to discuss the consequences of being LGBT rather than LGB. it is possible. I think it would have been possible actually to include the T in a different way. But the way they did it was to go completely overboard and focus on gender identity. Now, everybody has an individual personality. Every single person is unique. And every single person is either male or female. That is sex. I mean, all right, there is 0.018, very, very teensy tiny little percentage of people in which you might say there's some lack of clarity, but essentially just like there's not many people who have 11 fingers. Almost everybody in the world is either male or female. This concept of gender identity has been stuck in between unique personality and sex, and a confusion has been created. And this is what queering means. Queering means getting rid of boundaries, getting rid of clarity, so that nobody even understands the difference between gender and sex anymore. And I remember when I was working at the ministry, actually, as a translator in the 1990s, and we were all told to stop saying sex, we had to say gender. And I thought, oh, okay, fine. I just thought, okay, it's because of the maybe smutty associations of sex, and they thought it was more polite to use the word gender. I didn't think about it. We all started using the word gender instead of sex. But now we see that the word gender is used in at least three different ways, and people don't even understand that it's used in three different ways. And the word gender identity has never defined by anybody. Yeah. Nobody knows what it is. In fact, if you push people to define it, it is not possible to define it in any way other than based on sexist stereotypes. And so to present it as progressive is just completely mad. So, but what happened is that when Stonewall moved from LGB to LGBT, and all the other groups did so, and based themselves on gender identity, it suddenly became an odd thing within the LGBTQIA community, which I'm afraid is not a community, to be attracted to people of the same sex. It was kind of outlawed. You were yesterday's equal. You were yesterday's movement. No, we've moved on now. We don't do that anymore. Same sex. No. It's all same gender now. But what does that mean? It means nothing. It means that that what we have always understood lesbianism to mean, women who are attracted to other women. And it's not just, they say you're focused on genitalia. No, actually, it's a much broader thing than that. To love other women, to be attracted to another woman, not just because of her body, but because she has spent her life as a girl and growing up as a girl into a woman, and you have that common experience, and that is part of sexual attraction. As far as I'm concerned, it's not a mere fact of bodies. It's an incredibly wide-ranging thing of shared female experience, and that is part of being a lesbian.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I noticed in checking out what's going on with same-sex marriage and the Marriage Act, I looked earlier on, and it's referred to as the Same-Sex Couples Act. So one of my things is, if we start tampering with these definitions and we change language, then all the legislation that's based on the accurate language has to be redone or falls through. It doesn't.
Well, you know that they don't, that the LGBTQ people don't refer to same-sex marriage anymore. They say equal marriage.
Yeah. And
marriage equality, and they don't like the word. They try to get rid of the word sex altogether. Yeah. Even in CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of all Discrimination Against Women. It's an important UN convention which is based on sex. It's about sex-based discrimination against women. But there is a movement to try and get sex removed and it to include gender instead. And this, people do not realize what is going on here. There was a most extraordinary, there was the most native, what was a horrible phrase used of women today? Native born uterus holders or something. Native uterus holders. I don't know where you've been holding your uterus, Paula, but I do.
I like the riposte, actually, that if a testicle holder told me that I was a womb holder, they'd take their testicles home in a box. I quite like that from somebody.
Now you mustn't get aggressive, Paula, because
I was amused, but yes, and we do need humour here, because it is beginning to feel like we're in the middle of a eugenics experiment, and it's 1984, and you know, the hate rallies. I mean, it's beyond.
It's really quite extraordinary that we have to spend so much of our lives explaining something which is completely and utterly obvious.
Yes, and what I was going to say is the average person in the street, whoever it is that you speak to, understands this stuff, and those of us that are active trying to maintain our boundaries end up looking loopy as well. It's like, why are you even talking about this?
Why aren't you talking about Ukraine? Why aren't you talking about the environment? Why aren't you talking about refugees? Why aren't you talking about huge gap between rich and poor? There are millions of things that I'm sure you and I feel also very passionate about. But the reason that I'm doing this rather than any of those other things is that nobody else was doing it.
Yes.
But somebody had to do it. And somebody has to reestablish the principle of the rights of people who have same-sex sexual orientation. And apparently it's too difficult. If you are young and perhaps you have young children, you're more vulnerable. If you have a job that you might lose, you're more vulnerable. You're younger. That's why this movement was created by a couple of old lesbians. We are less vulnerable, and therefore we have a duty. We have a duty to do this because we are less vulnerable to all the attacks that people launch against us. They do launch against us, but
well, I'd like to say, Bev, that going right back to the beginning of your interview, from that first moment that you spoke out when you were 11, it was always going to be you that did this, and thank you for doing it, because somebody had to, and wish LGB Alliance all the best, because whatever happens with Stonewall, we will always need somebody that's focusing on sexual orientation, and that's what you're doing. So I think
I do feel that this is my destiny, and I've never, although it's profoundly depressing at times, I have met the best people in my life in the last 3 years, and I love it. I do feel I'm where I have to be. I'm doing what I must do.
And I'd just like to finish with throwing out almost like casting a fishing line. So your young self, if you were coming out today, what on earth would be happening with you? And how can we make it that young Bev would have found her way to LGB Alliance?
We need more lesbian role models. We need also the informative material. When you're presenting informative material to schools, we looked at this shocking LGBTQ action plan that they put out in Wales. Why was there no literature, novels by James Baldwin, or that would encourage children to read about other lesbian and gay heroes and identify with them? We need to encourage our young LGB teens who are just exploring their own sexual orientation to read about to read novels and to read documentaries, to read the real history,
read our history,
Pride movement, and instead of all the complete nonsense that they're being told about Pride. It's extraordinary how easy it is to lie to people these days. I find that very, very disturbing. And Pride was created in New York by 2 gay men and 2 lesbians. That is the truth. It was not created by trans women of color. I have nothing against trans women of color, but it just so happens that they did not create Pride. So why do we have to keep, and also in the gay liberation movement, I'm sorry, but it was gay men and lesbians. That is, I was there.
Yeah.
There is no need to rewrite history in order to stand up for the rights of transgender people. It's good that trans people stand up for their rights, but please do not misrepresent the past. It's not necessary, and we will all get on much better if we have dialogue with each other and try to work in the Dutch way towards, pragmatically towards a future that works for us all.
Yeah. Absolutely. And one of the things I know that you're in the midst of at the moment is actually reaching out to LGB youth. Do you just want to mention that? What's this?
Well, we're not
project?
reaching out yet because in order to work with young people, you need a huge safeguarding apparatus. And what we've done now, the grant that we've received from the National Lottery Communities Fund, is to scope our project. And it's something we wanted to do since the very beginning, and we would have been able to do it earlier if we hadn't been spending so much time defending ourselves from completely lunatic attacks on our organization. But what we want to do is to set up a helpline for teenagers who are struggling with their sexual orientation and as distinct from gender identity, which is a separate issue. And we know that there's a need for this because every day we get messages from people saying, you know, where is it? Where is it? What can I do? It's all the emphasis everywhere is on gender identity. So there's a need for it. And this initial grant will be able to scope the plan and set it up properly. We've got some fantastic experts on safeguarding and on running helplines with enormous experience working with us, a real good range of experts. And once we've scoped it, then we will put in obviously put in a bid for the actual helpline itself, which will be an online resource to help teenagers who are struggling with their sexual orientation and who do not want to be drawn into a discussion of gender identity, which is something that's been planted on and I think has done quite a lot of harm. And
in fact, if there are young people who want to do that, then there is absolute wall-to-wall carpeting where they can find that. So let's allow for there to be this space where those of us that know what same-sex attraction is can be busy working. So that's all I wanted to ask you. Was there anything else you wanted to add before we finish?
Let's listen to each other and not pander to extremism, and also obviously I end any speech I give with, please don't give in to fear. If you are able to stand up and be identified and say what you think, please do so. If you're not, don't feel bad about it. There are other things you can do. You can either contribute financially, or you can write to your MP or to your local school. There are lots of different ways to contribute if you feel there's something wrong and you would like to help promote the struggle to revive LGB rights in this country. There's lots of different ways to get involved, but if you're able to speak out, please do so, because every voice helps.
Okay, and thank you, Bev. And obviously your very, very graphic description of doing that as a youngster will be pinned in the mind of anybody that's listened. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Paula.